Good morning, everyone. Firstly, I would like to thank you for the inspiring reflections we've been sharing these 2 days. I'm gaining a lot from you. Thank you, Jürgen, for Europa. I was surprised to be selected. Hopefully you did well. First of all, please take this talk as an invitation to think about an exploratory idea and less as a result of an exhaustive research about a specific topic. I will take you in a fast-paced presentation of my points. I feel like many of them were already approached yesterday and even today by Nicolo. I'm afraid I'm also finding it difficult to be optimistic regarding the current status quo. But I also don't see necessarily pessimism as a problem. As you will understand, I believe that our reluctance in embracing pessimism might be preventing us to see fundamental problems and to engage their solutions. Having this said, I cannot identify myself with less than a believer. Without further ado, off we go. The title. The title says a lot, so much that perhaps the easiest way to make this presentation is to explain its title. Firstly, I will address the 21st century dystopia and what I mean by it. Secondly, I will make a brief passage through liberal democracy history with the help of Chantal Mouffe. Afterwards, I will share my points on European Youth Work and its liberal democratic affiliation. And finally, I make some suggestions on how to unlearn and disengage this liberal democratic affiliation. Let's start then. Europe and the world are going through dystopian times. Nevertheless, liberal democracies thrive. The refugees crisis lasts 10 years of political impasse. Economic inequality keeps growing. Education systems seem structurally crystallized ad aeternum. Public policies mainstream sophisticated forms of racism. Quota regimes are necessary to enforce gender equality. Neoliberalism and individualism are fiercely stepping over common rights. The destruction of the planet reached no return metabolic rifts. Historical colonial deeds remain celebrated and openly reproduced. The commoditization of human rights, such as in housing, education, and health systems, is globally naturalized. A growing percentage of people is facing burnout. Populism and authoritarian leadership is leveraging on people's skepticism over democracy institutions. The coronavirus pandemic and the competition on assessing a possible vaccine is re-illustrating the inability for cooperation at global level, even if the goal is preventing a massive death toll or human extinction. Stuart Mill, perhaps the most influential figure in modern liberalism, defined himself utopia as something too good to be practical. He also referred to dystopia as something too bad to be practicable. What more needs the practice to do in order to be bad enough for earning the dystopia describer? Through which utopia did we reach this point? A bit of history regarding liberal democracy might help us answering this question. Following the 18th century American and French revolutions, the Enlightenment ideas such as rationalism, universalism, or individual rights and freedoms were widely mainstreamed through a succession of liberal revolutions. Liberalism guided the most foundational democratization process in Europe and beyond, triggering 3 waves of democracy. The definite plateau for modernity, universal suffrage, universal access to education, and the establishment of a universal declaration of human rights. While liberal democracies achieved unquestionable deeds in the global panorama, for many, they are still far from reaching their fundamental promises of social justice, peace, equality, or human dignity. Chantal Mouffe illustrates the paradoxical nature of the articulation between the democratic tradition, the Athens legacy, and the liberal tradition, the Enlightenment ideas forming what is nowadays the hegemonic and hardly contested political system, the liberal democracy. The impossible reconciliation between these two traditions configure risks that can be very observable in the 21st century. For example, the constitutional punishing of the will for independence of Catalonia in 2017 represents the very negation of popular sovereignty, in the name of the freedoms foreseen in the Spanish liberal constitution itself. For MOVE, liberal democracies feature unchallenged hegemonies that conflict with and undermine democratic values such as equality, plurality, or human dignity. I will not spend much time explaining each of these threats. Perhaps the most obvious ones are capitalism and neoliberalism, with its very peculiar interpretation of which rights are important and non-negotiable. She also signalizes as a threat the establishment of a commoditized human rights as the expression of a dominant hegemony. It is indeed another paradox to advocate for human dignity through a system of rights that require in practice a price to be enjoyed. Also, as we know, the price is hugely different for each individual, including many of us that cannot afford and therefore cannot enjoy their human rights. It is this idea of democracy, even of an imperfect one. The end of the Cold War, symbolized by the iconic fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, crystallized and celebrated the well-intentioned liberal democratic ideology as the single, ultimate, and superior democratic possibility. Since then, liberal democracies thrive, but present an important epistemological limitation, the one of thinking about alternative democratic systems. Hence, hindering the possibility of critically thinking about the liberal democracy itself. The generated incapacity for auto-analysis might well be one of the main reasons why contemporary authoritarian-like high-level initiatives and politicians are often rendered as a glitch of the system, and not necessarily as an obvious dystopian product of liberal democracies themselves. The same applies to the rhetoric of the civil society dark side, as Siri mentioned yesterday. The dark side is no less than a product of a darker or brighter social political system. Let's move now to the liberal democratic dimension of European youth work. Since the earliest years of the 21st century, youth has been consolidated as a key policy at intergovernmental level, boosting a billionaire growing budget funding youth work in Europe. Youth organizations and youth workers were financially and politically empowered to develop a sector, widening up the space for the social participation of young people under the rhetoric of transformation. As a pinnacle motto, youth work has been endurably resorting in Peter Lauritsen's description of the sector's main objective, to provide opportunities for young people to shape their own futures. But is youth work following Lauritsen's motto? Or is it providing young people as opportunities for the liberal democratic future to keep being shaped? In the last 20 years, many of the opportunities for young people were endowed by the political goals and traditions enacted by liberal democracy institutions. Initiatives such as the European Commission Youth Guarantee, widely implemented in the continent with the collaboration of youth organizations and youth workers, conform young people into a certain society. The enlistment in the labor market is the priority over the critique of the globalized model of work. The Youth Guarantee is an example among many others of how European youth policy can paradoxically relegate the participation of young people and youth workers to a shrinking space of non-contestation, where the liberal democratic project endures and prospers. Many of the estimated 1.7 million youth workers in Europe depend on intergovernmental policies such as the ones from the European Union, the Council of Europe, or the United Nations. The complicities between European youth work praxis and liberal democratic values are indisputable. Despite their good intentions, youth workers find themselves with few to no alternatives to engage and reproduce what is supra-proposed to them. Aware or not, deliberate or not, the liberal democratic affiliation of European youth workers limits their agency on reflecting and providing opportunities for reflection about alternatives to the hegemonic and dystopic status quo. Hence, the shrinkage of youth workspace is solid and growing. We tackled this yesterday when we were thinking about youth work as a service provision, and with the metaphor of slowly plucking the chicken brought by Thomas. Milan Kundera portrays a similar paradox in his book Immortality, when he refers to some of his modern characters as the brilliant allies of their own grave diggers. Their imperative allegiance to modernity was paradoxically their immediate solution and their escalating insignificance. Certainly, the European youth work is very far from insignificant, especially for young people. Nonetheless, the limitations posed by the dominant ideological framework seriously hinder the counter-hegemonic possibilities, especially for young people. Racism, patriarchy, economic inequality, colonization, and extractivism as byproducts of the Enlightenment empires ideologically codified in today's liberal democracies may sophisticate, but will remain only marginally contested as it happened in the last 5 centuries, since when their globalization process has initiated. What can youth workers do to break the social reproduction cycle? Unlearning and disengaging might be something. So, I spoke about how youth work is influenced by external actors. Now I will add another layer, which is in a way about how youth workers influence each other. Peter Haas theorizes in detail how epistemic communities are formed and the normative constraints they entail. As any consolidated sectorial practice, European youth work faces an epistemic lockdown. I borrowed the metaphor I learned from Mattia Lossego, a youth worker and a friend, which refers to the youth work sector as a bubble. Lana referred to it yesterday, and Howard made a point from it. Our praxis follows an installed discipline, defining the values, objectives, resources, frameworks, methodologies, spaces, procedures, possible innovations, timings, and assessments. As I mentioned, there is a strong intergovernmental influence in youth work practice, definitely informed by the liberal democratic project. For example, while a co-ear human rights culture in the sector endures in preventing and regulating discrimination in youth work spaces, Eurocentrism configures an epistemic limitation, relegating ideas, projects, and virtues of many, in particular, the ones disengaged from the future hegemonically chosen for them. Widening the possibilities for youth work, for young people, and opening up the European youth work space for unprogrammed plurality means unlearning the liberal democratic epistemic normative, welcoming and accommodating its beyondness. By working in 2 dimensions, oneself and practice, youth workers can embrace the exploration of alternate visions of the world and society. The following are some possibilities for youth workers to disengage what I'm calling the 21st century liberal democracy dystopia. Working oneself means to reurbanize one's calendar canon and to reject professional busyness as a status and to establish a clear calendar allocation for one's interests, such as simple thinking. Also, reading beyond the usual. Escaping European youth work publications can be an important step in embracing the exploration of non-Eurocentric readings. Lastly, learning by writing. More than an important balancing of the epistemic power asymmetry, writing is a way to consolidate thinking, often solving its blind angles. Writing can be a powerful way to organize and communicate counter-hegemonic ideas. Working the practice includes naturalizing problematization. The complexity of structural social realities, such as racism, patriarchy, capitalism, or democracy, requires safe spaces for critical and radical thinking. The normative boundaries of the stable, the reasonable, or the good can be interrupted by allowing ideological ambiguity and plurality into youth workspaces. Everything is problematizable, and not every problem comes necessarily with a solution. Also, welcoming criticism and dissensus instead of bulldozing it and rejecting stigmatizing narratives such as difficult participants or difficult trainers can provide contextualized sociological answers for contradictions faced by youth workers every day. Secondly, detaching own practices from normative canon. Many practices or community is mainstreaming are flawed, requiring a continuous insight. The critique and detachment of a consolidated practice might be demanding, even overwhelming, but might also be very rewarding for the youth sector. If many people are doing it in the same way, it might well mean that many people underthought whatever is wrong with it. Thirdly, dissenting from professional self-indulgence. Howard mentioned this yesterday. As well-intentioned one can be, making use of a privileged network for getting contracts or accepting involvement in non-plural initiatives for the income reproduce problems of the youth sector, leaving behind many young people and youth work colleagues. Also, easily the need to engage the political game meets self-indulgence. The game only works because people play it. We are entitled to choose which game to play, and how far our revenue influence that choice or not. Lastly, disengaging installed narratives. Discourse is an effective tool in codifying, reproducing, and sophisticating ideas among the epistemically bonded public. Understanding the symbolic meaning of the discourse used in youth work can help to actively deconstruct the narratives aiming to the liberal programmed futures, such as in democracy. What happens to our democratic imaginary when we refer to liberal democracy as democracy? Human rights. What happens with socially excluded, with the socially excluded when human dignity is only asserted through human rights? Participation. At which extent the participation representation binary obliterates the power of the people? Competences. To whom are competences giving power to? Who ends up excluded from what? Transformation. How far is transformation a sophisticated form of reproduction? Are sustainable development goals, green economy, or migration policies really changing something? The last one is a bonus for our chat. Prevention of radicalization. Who ends silencing who and why? So, hopefully I was able to explain you the title. I can't finish without reinforcing that my critique of liberal democracy should not be misunderstood with the promotion of illiberal democracies or with the tabula rasa of the democratic achievements. Such understanding would work against welcoming plurality within the spaces claimed to be shrinking. Thank you very much for your interest. I hope this is useful for you. I'm looking forward to know your thoughts in the discussion, and I'll be very happy to answer any question you may have. Thank you very much.